Alrighty, my friends. So for this last video, for this particular module of this particular week, I want us to consider how can we fix water pollution? What are ways that we can look into fixing water or kind of the overall downline impacts, but also how can we treat water? So we'll focus a little bit more on what we can do as an individual, ways that we look in kind of the broader scale, and ways that we treat wastewater in particular. And that's actually part of two of your assignments this week, actually, is to consider these particular areas. So if you need to review ways in which we can pollute water, please refer back to the previous videos. And if not, then here we are. So something big to consider is to refer back to this watershed approach. So reminding ourselves, this is where a lot of fresh water comes from. We'll come from the top of the divides and go down either side of said divides. And again, recalling back that the closer you are to the top of the gradient, the cleaner the water is likely to be. Versus down at the bottom of that gradient, the more pollutants could potentially be there. So we want to consider, how can we fix pollution? How can we go about finding the sources in which pollution is coming from so that we can eliminate the pollution for folks down the line? Usually finding sources with this approach is relatively easy, right? Because you keep testing the waters as we go down the gradient, and so it's much easier to find the sources in this manner. So you just need to look upstream, right? What is happening upstream that is causing some sort of pollution? So please be sure to review this idea if you need to. So improving water quality. What are things that you can do as an individual? So there's this graphic here on the right-hand side, which is from your book, and it's showcasing stormwater runoff and what can be done in this case to help aid in kind of filtering out the water before it makes it into waterways. So of course, planting trees, which allow infiltration of runoff. Things like rain barrels can capture runoff from the roof or redirect it through a downspout. You could have something like a green roof, like the Cal Academy of Sciences has a living roof, which is freaking awesome, which allows for water to be trapped on top of that roof and be used by the plants that are there. And then, of course, kind of rain gardens, of course, and through a gutter and capturing that lawn runoff. So these are ways that your home can be improved to allow for trapping of stormwater. But something I do very much want to mention is many scientists these days don't encourage capturing rainwater and being available as drinking water, mostly because our atmosphere is pretty well polluted at this point. And so as raindrops come down the atmosphere, they're collecting pollution along the way. So I want you to consider right before we start to get into our rainy season here in the Bay Area, and looking around in the air around you, even if it's been just a couple of weeks since we've had rain. And if you say go out into a lookout and look across the bay, or you drive over one of the bridges in the bay and you look over safely, and you notice that you see sort of haze, right? And then maybe it rains for a day or two, and then you do that same analysis and you notice how the air is really clear. That's because all that rain picked up all of that really gross pollution that was suspended in the air. So generally don't recommend trapping rainwater and using it for consumption without boiling it or treating it in some way. Anyways, here are some other ways in which you can help improve water quality overall. Water conservation and efficiency. You don't need to keep your faucet on for the full 2 minutes that you're brushing your teeth. You don't need to take a half an hour long shower for every single shower that you do. I know it feels really nice, but you don't have to do that. Consuming less stuff. This is big, right? If you go back to last week's material, we talked about how much water goes into various industries. You don't need to go to Forever 21 or Shein or Zara or Nike and buy a new outfit every single day. Consume less, or consider changing your dietary habits. Things like that. Using less energy, of course, driving less, non-toxic cleaners in as much as you can. Plant drought tolerant native plants for your area, which again changes from area to area, region to region. Try to use less or no fertilizers or pesticides. Again, of course, I know this is not feasible for everybody, especially if you have something like a farm, just doesn't make sense. Things you can also do would be to volunteer with local stream or bay restoration groups. Picking up after your pets, really big thing here, right? They have their waste out in the lawns and streets and stuff, so picking up after them is very important. And then, of course, help spread the word. So you are now armed with all of this knowledge, so you can then educate your friends and family along the way. Like, say you're walking your friend's dog with your friend, and then they poop, and then they walk on over, and you're like, wait, no, hang on, there's doggy bags. That's what those are for, right? And properly taking care of that waste. What we can do on a broader level and on maybe more on like the local government or federal government level would be things like municipal sewage treatment, purifying drinking water, and then lastly, of course, legislation. So I'm going to touch on each of these ideas a bit further. Starting with municipal sewage treatment, which is also known as water recycling, also known as wastewater treatment. So it's very likely that every township, every city, perhaps every even county, depending on state by state, will have some sort of wastewater treatment plant. So we're going to consider all of this stuff as wastewater treatment. And in the Bay Area, actually, there's lots of various wastewater treatment plants, and they all dump kind of into one area, meaning the Bay, which is one reason why I will always say that the San Francisco Bay is kind of gross, not because I hate it, but it's because of things that go into it. That's kind of disgusting. And I encourage you actually to, I think one of your field trip options is to either go to a local wastewater treatment plant or to watch a video or two on them. It's a really, really fascinating way to learn about what happens to things that go down your drain. So focusing on wastewater treatment in particular first, there's basically 4 main steps that go into wastewater treatment. And again, this will vary from location to location, but every location will start with a primary treatment, and that is the physical separation and removal of large solids. So solids settle and oils float, which will then leave the more viable water kind of in between. Then there's usually a secondary treatment where there's the biological degradation of organic compounds. This comes from naturally occurring microorganisms where air is actually added to the water, which allows for this decomposition to happen, for those microorganisms to be like, oh, hey, I need to do something. Then sometimes there's this tertiary treatment, which is an advanced treatment. This is not always required, but some things can include like wetlands or carbon filters or things of that nature. When I lived in Tucson for graduate school, I noticed that the drinking water there, I don't think it had this sort of tertiary treatment. So I had a Brita water filter that I used for my drinking water that I kept in my fridge. But not only did I also have that, which I believe was a carbon treatment, I also had like this little carbon, almost looked like a little carbon log in that as well. So I kind of had a dual treatment, and this is because the water there was so terrible that I felt the need to treat it twice over how it's already being treated and put into our faucets. This is often why folks will prefer to drink bottled water over tap water, though thankfully here in the Bay Area, the water we get here is from Hetchy, and it's delicious, and we can just drink it straight out of the tap, which is great. But not everywhere is like that. There's also potentially this level of disinfection. So this kills microorganisms in the water. This is usually from things like chlorine, which is one way that I could definitely smell it in the water in Tucson. Like literally taking a shower would smell like a pool because there's so much chlorine in the water. Or using ozone, which is kind of interesting. Or a common thing for anyone who maybe does camping or anything like that, using an ultraviolet light to kill microorganisms. This was also a way that my partner and I would treat water when we were over in Southeast Asia, namely in the country of Myanmar. The water coming out of the faucets was brown, like a light brown, which is pretty gross. But that's even the water that we would brush our teeth with because it's what was coming out of the faucet in the bathrooms. So we would have this UV light. It doesn't change the color of the water, but it did at least kill any microbiomes that were hanging out in the water, which is again kind of gross, but here we are. Here's just a visual representation of wastewater treatment. So again, starting with the primary, so you would have these filters that you have the sludge kind of come in, the solids sink, any sort of oils would float. Then it can go into the secondary treatment where you have this air pump, which allows for air to facilitate the microorganisms to start doing their thing. And then you have this final settling tank here and this sludge, which the sludge is then either incinerated, composted, or used as soil amendment. And then again, you can go through these potential 2 last steps. You could go through a tertiary and then go through disinfection, or the other way around. It really just depends on the potential or who's doing the water treatments. So what happens next? So the treated water can then go into things like irrigation or released into natural waters. You may find on things like golf courses where it'll say using recycled water. So I know golf courses do get a lot of flack, especially here in California or even in Arizona, where it's like super desert regions. We're supposed to be doing water conservation, but you're keeping these golf courses super green. What's going on there? They're usually using non-potable water. And so I want you to consider maybe other ways that treated water could be used without maybe coming back into your tap necessarily. And then with the sludge or the biosolids, those can go into anaerobic digestion, can be used as fertilizer, but there, of course, there's kind of some health risks there. Again, going back to that heavy metal idea. It could be composted, it could be dumped into the ocean, or used to be dumped into the ocean. This has since been banned. Huzzah, that's great. But a lot can also be used in landfills where it helps with that kind of like daily aeration of the landfill. And again, what can we do? What are ways that you can kind of better your own habits to help aid in this process of water treatment to make their jobs a lot easier and better? Consider things like what good in means good out. So things you could do there would don't flush anything that's not supposed to be flushed. This includes feminine products like tampons or pads, or even the flushable baby wipes. Those are generally can clog up the things, or any sort of solid object that should not be flushed down the toilet. Or don't use harmful chemicals for cleaning. A lot of chemicals are not meant to be going down the drain necessarily. Don't flush your pharmaceuticals or narcotics. This can be kind of a way perhaps that folks who maybe are trying to hide a drug habit will maybe flush things down the toilet. Well, guess what? That goes into the waterways and can have some impacts there. And then lastly, of course, water conservation. Us here in California, we know about this pretty well. But less water down the drain means less water needs to be treated. So again, you don't need to take a 30-minute shower 3 times a day. You don't need to necessarily flush the toilet all of the time, or keep your faucet going for the 2 minutes you're brushing your teeth, that kind of thing. Next, I want to talk a bit about the purification of drinking water. So wastewater treatment does not necessarily mean that we're going to be using that water to drink, though if you refer back to some treatment plants do indeed do this. It's something that we, of course, need to consider. But what tends to happen here is water collection and storage, usually within a dam or a reservoir. Then you have the coagulation of the water and filtration. Then oftentimes you'll have a pH adjustment. So you want to make the water less acidic. And then, of course, disinfection, meaning generally chlorination, and then, of course, distribution. So here's just a very simplified schematic of the general purification of drinking water. So these aren't always the steps for everywhere. That's a big thing to consider. And then sometimes where this pH adjustment does not happen can be very detrimental. I want you to think about the Flint, Michigan water crisis. They weren't doing this pH adjustment in that water, which led to the insane disaster that was there. So the super high acidic water dissolved those very old lead pipes. It dissolved that lead into the drinking water. And as we know, lead is a neurotoxin. So it's really, really, really not good to consume. So I want you to think of other ways in which maybe you've heard about drinking water disasters. Lastly, we need to, of course, consider some of the laws that help control water pollution. As usual, these laws came into play in the 1970s. The Clean Water Act was made to improve the quality of the rivers, lakes, aquifers, estuaries, and coastal waters. to hopefully help eliminate discharge of pollutants into our waterways, help with water quality control. But of course, like anything else in the government, there's completely a dire lack of funding, which can help aid to the lack of enforcement, right? If you don't have the money to help enforce these ideas, you're not going to have them be enforced. And this is through the EPA. And as we know, some previous administrations want to kind of cut the EPA because who cares about, having regulations or whatnot. I do also want to mention that both of these laws have gone through several amendments along the way as well. Even though they came into law in the 1970s, there have been some changes. And then lastly, the Safe Drinking Water Act. So this was to help set uniform federal standards for drinking water to help guarantee a safe public water supply. Because, prior to this law coming in, states had their own standards, which I'm sure, as you can imagine, those standards varied widely from state to state. So they just wanted to make one umbrella federal law for this idea. So this would help set maximum contaminant levels at the federal level for what contaminants to test for. And there's two tiers to this. There's primary, which means contaminants for human health, and then there's secondary, which means that there's ecological or aesthetic standards, but not necessarily bad for human health or human consumption. So again, consider all of these things. We just talked about a lot of really interesting ideas here. So I want you to maybe go back to some of these ideas, review them as needed, and then we can potentially, I can answer or address any questions, and it will help you with these, the content quiz and also your assignments for this week. So thank you so much for your time and attention and for watching, and I'll see y'all same time, same place next week. Cheers.